They say waking at 5 a.m. is the foundation of a healthy life. They say early rising builds discipline, energy, and longevity. And on the surface, it can look exactly like that. But inside the body, something far more precise is already underway. Every morning, before the alarm sounds, before the eyes open, the body has already begun a hormonal sequence running in humans for millions of years, a chemical tide. However, a biological clock so accurate that light itself is one of its calibration instruments. At the center of this morning architecture sits a molecule called cortisol, produced by two small glands resting silently above the kidneys. What happens to that molecule when the body is forced to rise at 5 a.m. every single day? At 5 a.m., most bodies are still in biological darkness. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, a cluster of roughly 20,000 neurons inside the brain's hypothalamus, governs the internal clock. It reads light, temperature, and chemical signals. It coordinates sleep cycles, and it instructs the adrenal glands when to begin releasing cortisol. In a naturally aligned circadian rhythm, this cortisol surge begins approximately 30 minutes before the anticipated wake time. Scientists call this the cortisol awakening response, the CAR. It is not a reaction to waking. It is a preparation for it. During the CAR, cortisol levels rise 50 to 100% above their overnight baseline. Metabolism accelerates. Blood glucose climbs. Immune cells reposition. The cardiovascular system gently increases its output. The body is warming its engine before the driver opens the door. Now consider a body whose natural internal clock is set for 7 a.m., but whose alarm is set for 5 a.m. At that precise moment, the adrenal glands have not yet received the signal. Cortisol is still near its overnight floor. The car has not begun. The engine has not been warmed. The alarm fires, the body rises, but the biology has not arrived yet. What the individual experiences as morning fatigue is not weakness. It is a body operating before its biochemical ignition sequence has completed. The adrenal glands are small. Each weighs no more than 5 grams, yet they produce one of the body's most essential daily chemicals. The cortisol belongs to a class called glucocorticoids, hormones derived from cholesterol, built inside the adrenal cortex, and released into blood following a tightly regulated daily pattern. This pattern follows a diurnal curve, rising sharply in the early morning, peaking within the first hour of waking, then declining steadily through the day, reaching its floor in the late evening. The mechanism behind this curve is the HPA axis, a 3-stage communication chain. When the hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, that signal reaches the pituitary gland, which releases adrenocorticotropic hormone. That hormone then travels to the adrenal glands, commanding cortisol production. This chain does not operate instantly. It is designed to begin in anticipation, not in reaction. The quality of the morning cortisol spike carries consequence. A robust CAR is directly linked to stronger metabolic activation, more precise immune calibration, and sharper cognitive function in the first hours of the day. When an early alarm arrives before the sequence initiates, the spike is either blunted, reduced in amplitude, or disrupted in timing. The body's biological forecast for the day is altered before the day has even begun. The body is not opposed to early rising, but it is not indifferent to it either. The internal clock is plastic. Given consistent external cues, stable light exposure, consistent meal timing, irregular sleep onset, the circadian rhythm will shift. The suprachiasmatic nucleus recalibrates. The adrenal system adjusts. The cortisol curve moves earlier. This biological adaptation is called circadian entrainment. However, entrainment requires the entire biological system to shift together, not just the wake time. Sleep onset must also move earlier. Total sleep must remain adequate, 7 to 9 hours for a healthy adult. The cortisol curve cannot migrate forward while the rest of the body's circadian architecture remains anchored to a later schedule. When a body wakes at 5 a.m. but falls asleep at midnight, a pattern common in those adopting early wake schedules without adjusting sleep timing, the cortisol system is placed under sustained tension. Under these conditions, the CAR becomes erratic. Some mornings it spikes too sharply as the HPA axis over-responds to the abrupt early disruption. Other mornings it is blunted, the adrenals under-responding after repeated exhaustive activations. This is not simply disrupted sleep. This is the beginning of HPA axis irregularity, an instability in the body's most fundamental daily hormonal rhythm. The culture around early rising is loud. The science is quieter and considerably more precise. The dominant cultural narrative frames 5 a.m. waking as a universal biological upgrade, available to anyone willing to apply enough consistency. And what this narrative omits is a well-established concept in sleep science: the chronotype. A chronotype is not a preference. It is not laziness or ambition. It is a genetically influenced biological trait that determines the natural timing of an individual's circadian rhythm. Research has identified polymorphisms in genes including PER3, clock, and CRY1, all directly involved in circadian timing, that create measurable differences in when different individuals' internal clocks are set to run. When early chronotypes have adrenal systems that naturally begin the CAR closer to 5 a.m. For them, waking early is alignment. Late chronotypes have the same HPA axis, the same cortisol curve, but it is positioned 2 to 3 hours later. Their cortisol peak arrives naturally closer to 8 or 9 a.m. For these individuals, a 5 a.m. alarm does not align them with biology, it interrupts it. With studies measuring salivary cortisol in late chronotypes forced to wake early consistently show blunted CAR profiles and elevated overnight cortisol, markers of chronic circadian tension. The body does not care about culture, it responds only to biology. Hormonal damage accumulates the way rust forms on metal left slightly damp for too long, slowly, invisibly, until function begins to shift. When cortisol timing becomes chronically dysregulated, the effects reach multiple organ systems simultaneously, without announcing themselves. Cortisol governs blood glucose signaling, instructing the liver to release glucose for fuel. When the cortisol pattern loses precision, this signaling loses precision. The pancreas compensates. Insulin responses become slightly more effortful. Across months, this adds metabolic friction to a system designed for smooth rhythmic operation. Cortisol also calibrates the inflammatory response. In its healthy morning peak, it acts as a natural anti-inflammatory agent, suppressing immune overactivation, balancing cytokine activity. When cortisol peaks at the wrong amplitude or wrong time, this calibration shifts. Low-grade systemic inflammation can quietly accumulate, measurable at the cellular level, invisible on the surface. The immune schedule itself depends on the cortisol curve. Natural killer cell activity, T-cell distribution, and cytokine signaling all follow the diurnal cortisol pattern. A disrupted curve produces a disrupted immune schedule. None of this generates immediate, obvious illness. The body compensates. It borrows from reserves, adjusts where it can. But biological compensation is not infinite. The system is not designed to operate indefinitely in a state of misalignment. The body communicates in biology. Every signal it produces has a physical source, a measurable process occurring inside a tissue, a gland, or a chemical pathway. When those signals are understood as biology rather than inconvenience, they become precise. Persistent morning fatigue in individuals with forced early wake times is not tiredness without cause. It is the measurable gap between where cortisol currently sits and where the body needs it to be for full physiological arousal. The machinery is running without its fuel having been delivered. Where difficulty maintaining focus in the early hours reflects an incomplete CAR magnitude. Cognitive readiness in the morning is partially a function of cortisol's peak amplitude. A blunted CAR produces reduced biochemical activation of the brain's alertness systems. Increased susceptibility to infection during periods of early forced waking, particularly when combined with shortened sleep, reflects the immune system's direct dependency on cortisol timing. When morning immune calibration is skipped or delayed, the body enters the day without its full defensive configuration. Afternoon energy crashes, appetite shifts, subtle temperature irregularities. These are not random discomforts. They are the circadian architecture expressing tension between its internal schedule and the external one imposed upon it. The body is not complaining, It is delivering information, precise, biological, and consistent. The body does not reward early rising simply because it is early. It responds to alignment. Cortisol is not a prize for discipline. It is a biological process, ancient, precise, and deeply individual. It rises on a schedule written in genetics, calibrated by light, and governed by a clock that intention alone cannot override. Whether 5 a.m. serves the biology or strains, it depends entirely on whether the internal clock has been given the conditions to arrive there naturally. The adrenal glands will produce cortisol every morning, but the quality and pattern of that production is shaped, quietly, cumulatively, by the conditions the body is placed in day after day. Health is not sudden, it is cumulative, and the body has always been keeping the record.